I never expected a simple favor for my sister to turn my world upside down. When Cora asked me to look after her husband, Blaine, while she traveled for work, I thought it would be a quiet summer in a big, empty house. But Blaine's looks, his strange behavior, and the unsettling glances he kept throwing my way hinted that something unusual was brewing. Each day seemed to pull me deeper into a world I didn't recognize, a world where innocence blurred into secrets, and the line between curiosity and something far more intense was becoming dangerously thin. My name is Lindsay Becker, and my life has always been about looking out for my younger sister, Cora. Growing up, I played the part of the protective older sister, always standing up for her, guarding her against heartbreak, and even teaching her how to navigate her teenage years with grace and confidence. At 29, I'm still single, teaching at a community college, while Cora, 6 years younger than me, is a professor at a prestigious university, married to Blaine Spencer. Blaine and Cora met during their college years, and as Cora always told me, it was love at first sight. While I respected her choice, I couldn't help but feel Blaine was, well, not quite the man I would have chosen for her. He was shorter, with an intellectual look that some might call boyishly handsome. Blaine's wiry build, fair skin, and wavy blonde hair contrasted with Cora's warmth and passion, though she found his studious charm irresistible. I never completely understood her attraction, but I trusted her judgment. After they married, Cora quickly advanced in her career, becoming a respected professor while Blaine, a freelance IT specialist, worked from home. They moved into an elegant, old-fashioned mansion provided by the university, sprawling rooms, grand fireplaces, and a picturesque view of the historic campus. I was proud of her and happy that she was doing well. However, beneath the surface, things were far from perfect. Cora's demanding schedule meant she was often out, leaving Blaine alone in a house filled with temptation. She confided in me that she sometimes worried about his loyalty, as he was charming and seemingly fascinated by the female students that filled the campus. When Cora had to travel to Europe for a few months, she asked if I'd move into her home and keep an eye on Blaine, just to ensure he wasn't up to anything. I agreed, hoping to ease her mind. After a couple of days, I began noticing peculiar behavior from Blaine. He was always dressed impeccably, often sporting a necklace that seemed overly delicate for a man, with his name in thin, feminine script. He made an effort to look presentable, as though I was a guest he aimed to impress rather than his sister-in-law. It wasn't just his appearance, he seemed determined to impress me in other ways, often cooking elaborate meals or offering glasses of wine late into the evening. While his politeness seemed innocent, his gestures felt somewhat rehearsed. One evening, after an exhausting day spent adjusting to my new surroundings, Blaine knocked on my door and invited me to join him for a glass of wine. I hesitated, unsure if I should accept, but decided to give it a chance, hoping this would make the awkwardness of our shared living space fade. We sat by the large fireplace in the living room, a quiet tension between us as we sipped the wine and discussed everything from his career to my teaching work. When I excused myself to retire, he insisted I take another glass for the road, which I did without much thought. That night, I was haunted by a dream so vivid and strange that I woke up feeling both unsettled and perplexed. In it, I was in the embrace of a man who felt both familiar and unfamiliar, his touch leaving a strangely lingering warmth. I shook it off as nonsense, but the next day, the sensation lingered, making me uneasy. As the days passed, the strange behavior escalated. Blaine was always nearby, watching closely, even as he pretended to be busy with his work. The mansion, with its creaking floors and shadowy hallways, started to feel like it held secrets within its walls, secrets Blaine seemed determined to keep from me. Then, one evening, I caught Blaine just as he was about to leave the house dressed far more stylishly than one might for a simple errand. He claimed he was meeting an old friend, but something in his tone felt evasive. That was when I started to suspect he was hiding something, and that I might be closer to the truth than I wanted to believe. The day after Blaine's mysterious outing, I woke with a strange sense of purpose. The odd dreams, the off-putting glances, and his evasiveness were wearing down my patience, and I was determined to find out what was going on. As I wandered the mansion alone, I resolved that today, I would confront Blaine, demand he tell me what was really happening here. I was prepared for a confession, an excuse, anything that would explain the uncomfortable tension that had been building between us. But the day passed uneventfully. Blaine stayed holed up in his office, working quietly. I went through my own day, catching up on some reading, walking through the gardens, trying to distract myself. By late afternoon, my suspicions seemed almost ridiculous. Maybe Blaine was just odd, I thought. A peculiar man with a peculiar charm. Yet, as I was about to put the whole thing behind me, I caught sight of a delicate pink satin ribbon lying in the hallway near his office. It seemed out of place, an item that belonged more to the wardrobe of a young girl than to the otherwise stately mansion. I hesitated, looking toward Blaine's closed office door, and reached down to pick it up, examining the silky fabric. Then I heard a low murmur coming from inside Blaine's office, a soft, high-pitched giggle that couldn't have been his. I felt my heart drop. I took a step closer, tiptoeing as quietly as I could, my ear pressed against the door. The muffled laughter sounded again, accompanied by Blaine's voice, speaking in a tone I'd never heard before, soft, almost pleading. My hands shook as I pressed closer, straining to hear, unsure of what I would do next. Then I heard it clearly, the words spoken in a voice I never would have associated with Blaine. "Yes, I'll wear it. I'll be your little princess," he whispered, his voice breathy, almost shaking. I stood frozen, a wave of shock and embarrassment washing over me. I backed away from the door, heart racing, afraid he'd hear me. My thoughts scrambled. I couldn't reconcile this Blaine, the subdued, quiet husband I knew, with the strange, submissive voice I'd just heard. A part of me didn't even want to know what was happening in that room, but the curiosity gnawed at me. In a daze, I walked back to my bedroom, clutching the pink ribbon in my hand like some forbidden relic. My mind was racing, and I had a gnawing feeling that this was only the beginning. That night, I tossed and turned, thoughts of Blaine and his strange behavior swirling through my mind. I wondered if I should tell Cora. But what would I even say? That I'd heard him talking to someone? No, she would think I was paranoid, or worse, that I was making things up. By morning, I was determined to get answers, even if that meant confronting Blaine. After breakfast, I waited until he'd retreated to his office, as he usually did. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and walked down the hallway, determined to face whatever lay behind that door. I knocked, a little too forcefully, and heard Blaine's panicked voice from inside. "Ah, yes. Come in." I opened the door to find him sitting at his desk, looking flustered, cheeks flushed. He was wearing an old sweater, but I noticed his hands were shaking as he quickly closed his laptop. "Blaine," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "we need to talk." "Sure, about what?" he stammered, eyes darting nervously around the room. "I found something yesterday, a ribbon. It was just outside your door, and I couldn't help but overhear something." I watched his expression change, his face going pale. "You heard something," he whispered, swallowing hard. "Yes, Blaine. I heard you talking about," I paused, unsure how to say it, "about being a princess." I forced the word out, hoping it would jar him into honesty. Instead, he seemed to shrink further, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. He let out a shaky breath and finally looked up at me. I didn't mean for you to hear that. It's complicated." He looked away, seeming both ashamed and defensive. "Why don't you try to explain?" I urged, sitting down across from him. My anger was replaced with a reluctant sympathy, a need to understand what had driven him to such strange behavior. "It started as a kind of role play," he said after a moment, barely looking at me. "At first, it was just harmless, a way to escape the pressures of life. But it became more. I started wearing things." His voice was barely a whisper now. I listened, unable to look away, shocked yet riveted. "Go on," I said softly. "After a while, I liked the way it felt. It made me feel free," he admitted, his voice trailing off in a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "Cora doesn't know," he added quickly, glancing up at me with a hint of desperation. "Why didn't you tell her?" I asked, barely able to keep the accusation out of my tone. "She wouldn't understand. I barely understand it myself." His voice was defensive now, an edge of panic creeping in. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "So when Cora's away, you indulge yourself?" He nodded, visibly relieved that I seemed to be grasping his dilemma. "Yes, but only when I'm alone. It's not something I'm proud of, Lindsay. It's just something I can't seem to control." He looked away, cheeks red. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of discomfort, pity, and a strange fascination I couldn't shake. This secret life Blaine was leading, the hidden world he'd carved out behind Cora's back, was both shocking and oddly compelling. "Do you feel guilty?" I asked, watching him closely. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I also feel liberated." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a spark of defiance there. "You're betraying her, Blaine. Do you realize that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. "Yes," he admitted, looking down, "but I don't know how to stop." His hands trembled as he spoke, and I felt a wave of pity wash over me. As I left his office, I was filled with conflicting emotions, disgust, pity, anger, and a strange curiosity that I couldn't quite explain. It was as though I'd glimpsed a part of Blaine that no one was supposed to see, a secret he'd hidden away for years. I felt unsettled, haunted by the knowledge, yet there was a part of me that wanted to see just how far he was willing to go. The days passed slowly, filled with tense silence and a strange awareness that Blaine and I shared a secret. He was more cautious, avoiding me when he could, but occasionally I'd catch him watching me, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and resentment. I tried to distract myself, but the image of Blaine as a princess lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the hidden life he led. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, listening, and then heard a faint knock. "Lindsay?" Blaine's voice was barely a whisper. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were downcast, and he held a small, wrapped package in his hands. I wanted to apologize, he stammered, thrusting the package toward me. I took it, unsure what to say, and unwrapped it to find a delicate pink scarf, similar to the ribbon I'd found in the hallway. "It's a peace offering," he said, his cheeks turning pink. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I forced a small smile. "Thank you, Blaine. But you need to know that I won't keep this a secret forever. Cora deserves to know the truth." He nodded, his expression one of resignation. "I know. I just wish things could be different." That night, I lay awake, the pink scarf clutched in my hand, a symbol of the strange bond Blaine and I now shared. The knowledge weighed on me, a heavy burden I wasn't sure I wanted to bear. A few days later, I decided to confront him once and for all. I'd reached my breaking point, and I couldn't continue living in this web of secrets and lies. I waited until he was in his office, then marched down the hallway, the pink scarf clutched in my hand. "Blaine, we need to talk," I said, stepping into the room. He looked up, eyes wide, and I could see the fear and resignation in his gaze. "I'm going to tell Cora," I said, my voice steady. "She deserves to know who you really are." He didn't protest, didn't try to defend himself. He simply looked away, shoulders slumped, as though he'd been expecting this all along. "I understand," he said quietly. "I won't stop you." I hesitated, surprised by his response. I'd expected anger, a plea for forgiveness, but he seemed almost relieved. "Why aren't you fighting this?" I asked, watching him closely. "Because, maybe it's time I stopped hiding," he said, a hint of defiance in his voice. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of closure. The secret was out, and there was no going back. As I turned to leave, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in weeks. But as I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that Blaine's betrayal was deeper than I'd imagined. And as I clutched the pink scarf in my hand, I knew that I'd never look at him the same way again. After my conversation with Blaine, I thought I would feel a sense of relief, but that feeling never came. Instead, I felt a strange kind of anger. Each day that passed, I felt the tension tighten, twisting something deep inside me, and I knew I wouldn't be satisfied until I had done something about it. Blaine had betrayed my sister, manipulated her, all while pretending to be the perfect husband. And he had dragged me into his charade, forcing me to carry his secret. I couldn't let it go. I had to make him pay. At first, I wasn't even sure what I wanted. The feeling was raw, unformed, but as the days passed, a plan began to take shape. If Blaine wanted to indulge in this secret life, then I would give him exactly what he wanted, only I would be in control. And by the time I was done, he'd regret ever bringing me into his web of lies. One morning, I knocked on his office door, feeling a sense of satisfaction as he jumped at the sound. He was on edge, almost as though he knew something was coming, though he had no idea how far I was willing to go. "Blaine," I said, keeping my tone sweet, almost friendly, "I need your help with something. Can you join me in the living room?" He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course," he said, trying to mask his suspicion. I led him to the spacious living room, where the morning sunlight streamed in through the large bay windows, casting long shadows across the room. I motioned for him to sit on the plush sofa, while I took the chair across from him. "I've been thinking," I began, "about our conversation. About everything you told me." Blaine shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Lindsay, I really appreciate your understanding. I know it was a lot to hear." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice calm. "And I think that if you're going to embrace this side of yourself, you should really commit to it." He looked up, confusion in his eyes. "Commit?" "Yes, Blaine. If you're going to be a princess, I let the word hang between us, watching as his cheeks flushed, then you should really go all the way. He swallowed hard, a flicker of fear in his gaze. What do you mean? Stand up, I commanded, my tone leaving no room for argument. He hesitated, glancing at me with a mixture of confusion and reluctance, but he obeyed. I could see the nerves flickering in his eyes, a faint tremor in his hands as he rose to his feet. I reached into a bag I'd placed on the table earlier and pulled out a garment, a delicate, lace-trimmed pink satin robe, complete with matching slippers. I held it out to him, watching as his eyes widened in shock. You want me to wear that?" he stammered, looking at me as though I'd lost my mind. "Yes, Blaine. I think it's time you embraced who you really are." I watched his face as the realization sank in. "And I'll be here to help every step of the way." For a moment, he stood frozen, eyes darting toward the door as though considering escape. But I was ready for that. I stood between him and the exit, my expression daring him to refuse. Finally, after a long silence, he reached out and took the robe from my hands, his movement slow and reluctant. "Good," I said, a sense of satisfaction warming me. "Put it on." He glanced around the room, as though hoping for some last-minute reprieve, but there was none. Slowly, he slipped out of his shirt, his hands fumbling as he pulled the pink robe around his shoulders. He looked both humiliated and oddly transfixed, as though caught between shame and intrigue. "Perfect," I said, clapping my hands together. "You look lovely, Blaine. Truly." He muttered something under his breath, cheeks bright red as he avoided my gaze. "Oh, don't be so shy," I said, my tone light and almost mocking. "After all, isn't this what you wanted? To feel pretty?" He shot me a look of desperation, but I ignored it. This was my show now, and he was going to play the part I'd chosen for him. I handed him a matching satin headband, watching as he placed it in his hair, the humiliation in his eyes deepening. "Now," I continued, "I think it's time we took this to the next level. Don't you?" What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, feigning innocence. "Oh, nothing too extreme. Just a little makeover." His eyes widened in horror, but I gave him no time to protest. I reached into the bag and pulled out a small makeup kit, setting it on the coffee table between us. His face paled as he realized my intentions. "Lindsay, please, I don't think this is." "Nonsense," I cut him off, my tone firm. "You wanted to be a princess, didn't you? Well, princesses don't go around without a little makeup." I picked up a tube of lipstick, twisting it open as I leaned toward him. "Now, hold still." Reluctantly, he obeyed, his lips parting slightly as I applied the soft pink color, transforming his mouth into something delicate, almost doll-like. I added a touch of blush to his cheeks, a hint of mascara to his lashes, and by the time I was finished, he looked unrecognizable. "There," I said, stepping back to admire my work. "You're beautiful, Blaine." He looked down, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, unable to meet my gaze. But I wasn't done yet. "Now, there's just one more thing," I said, pulling out a small mirror and holding it up for him to see. "Take a look." His eyes widened as he stared at his reflection, the shock and humiliation evident on his face. I watched as he struggled to process what he was seeing, his hands trembling slightly as he touched his made-up face. "See? You make a lovely princess," I said, my voice dripping with mock sweetness. "And this is just the beginning." He looked at me, a mixture of fear and pleading in his eyes. "Lindsay, please, I don't want this." "Oh, but Blaine," I replied, my voice soft and dangerous, "I think you do." Over the next few days, I made sure that Blaine's transformation was thorough and complete. Each morning, I would instruct him on how to apply his makeup, making sure he followed each step precisely. I taught him to walk in delicate heels, insisting that he wear them around the mansion until he was comfortable. At first, he resisted, his face filled with embarrassment and shame as he stumbled awkwardly in the heels. But I was relentless, pushing him further each day, refusing to let him back down. I could see his pride crumbling, piece by piece, until he finally stopped resisting altogether, accepting his new role with a kind of numb obedience. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. One afternoon, I handed him a small bag filled with delicate lingerie, a lace-trimmed camisole, a pair of silk stockings, and a matching garter belt. His face turned bright red as he realized what I was asking of him. "Lindsay, this is going too far," he protested, his voice trembling. "Oh, I don't think so," I replied, my tone firm. "If you want to live this secret life, then you need to embrace it fully. Now go put it on." He looked at me, desperation in his eyes, but he knew better than to argue. Slowly, he took the bag from my hands, his fingers trembling as he disappeared into his room to change. When he returned, I could see the humiliation in his eyes, the way he avoided my gaze as he stood before me, dressed in the delicate, feminine garments I'd chosen for him. He looked fragile, vulnerable, a far cry from the man he'd pretended to be. "Good," I said, nodding in approval. "You're learning." For weeks, I kept him under my control, pushing him further each day, testing his limits, breaking down his pride. I made sure he understood that this was his punishment, that he would have to submit to my every demand if he wanted to keep his secret safe. And he obeyed, his spirit crushed, his will broken, until he was nothing more than a hollow shell of the man he'd once been. It was a cruel satisfaction, watching him transform, knowing that I was in complete control. Finally, one evening, I decided that it was time for the final step. I called him into the living room, instructing him to sit down, his face pale with anticipation. "Blaine," I began, my voice calm and steady, "it's time for you to face the truth." He looked at me, confusion flickering in his eyes. What do you mean?" "I mean, it's time for you to tell Cora everything." "Oh, I can," I replied, my tone cold and unyielding. "And I will. She deserves to know the truth about her husband. But she'll never forgive me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's not my concern," I said, my voice hard. "You made your choices, Blaine. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." He looked at me, desperation in his eyes, but I knew that he had no other choice. And as he sat there defeated, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a sense that justice had finally been served. The next morning, Cora returned home, completely unaware of the chaos that had unfolded in her absence. Blaine stood by my side, his face pale, his hands trembling as he waited for the inevitable confrontation. When Cora walked through the door, her face lit up with a warm smile, but her expression quickly changed as she took in the scene before her. Her eyes widened as she looked at Blaine, her gaze flickering between him and me, confusion and disbelief written on her face. What is going on?" she asked, her voice filled with shock. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. "Cora," I began, my voice steady, "there's something you need to know." And as I told her everything, watching the horror and betrayal fill her eyes, I knew that Blaine's punishment was complete. As I finished recounting Blaine's secrets to Cora, the room was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. Blaine stood nearby, his shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, looking nothing like the man Cora had married. Cora's face was pale, her eyes locked on Blaine with a mix of disbelief and a deeper, darker sense of betrayal. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, she simply sat there absorbing the shock. Finally, she looked up, her voice low, controlled. "Blaine," she began, each word slow and deliberate, "is this true?" He swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes," he whispered, voice barely audible. Cora looked away, her face unreadable. The anger and hurt were there, but beneath them was something else, something I couldn't place. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, slow breath as if trying to absorb the weight of it all, to decide what came next. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she looked up, her gaze fixed on me. "Lindsay," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I think it's time for you to leave." The words stung more than I'd expected. I had been prepared for her anger, her shock, even her disbelief, but this dismissal felt like a slap. I had thought I was helping her, protecting her, bringing to light a truth she needed to know. But as I looked at her, I realized that maybe, in her eyes, I had gone too far. I only wanted to protect you, Cora," I managed, my voice uncertain. "I know," she replied, her tone softening just a bit. "But this is between Blaine and me now. Please, just give us some space." I hesitated, feeling the strange mix of satisfaction and regret that had been building inside me. With a final look at Blaine, standing there, broken and ashamed, I turned and walked out of the house, my mind racing with questions that I knew would never be answered. Outside, I paused, the cool air filling my lungs as I tried to process everything. I had come here to watch over Cora, to protect her, but somewhere along the way, things had spiraled out of control. As I walked down the quiet street, I felt the weight of the past few weeks settle over me, a lingering uncertainty that I couldn't shake. I didn't know what Cora would decide, if she would find it in herself to forgive Blaine, or if this betrayal would be the end of their marriage. And maybe, just maybe, I'd been too eager to play a part in their lives, too quick to seek justice in a situation that wasn't mine to control. In the end, I realized, some secrets are better left buried, and some truths come at too high a price.